Okay, so when I said I would like to talk about how bryophytes cope with winter, it was because um, the seasonality of bryophyte growth is something that's always been interesting to me. I started my bryology in coast of California, where there really were just two seasons, and then I moved to New York, and for grad school too, I worked on tropical bryophytes. So something I sort of put on the back burner until moving to Colorado, where again I began to wonder just what are bryophytes doing in the wintertime? Um, what factors are controlling where they grow? How does a winter season affect their reproductive cycle? And how do those strategies differ among different types of bryophytes? Um, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at bryophytes in winter, nor taking pictures of them. So Stacy was kind enough to give me some wonderful pictures. So almost all the pictures of bryophytes in winter are due to Stacy. So thank you. Thank you again, Stacy, for that. I never imagined when I signed up to do this talk that I'd be doing it on a day in February when it was 70 degrees here in Littleton, Colorado. But it's not typical, and I assume somewhere in the mountains, the bryophytes are experiencing some winter. So, of course, winter means a lot of different things in different places and in different years, as we're seeing here, essentially no winter. And of course, many of those of you who live in coastal California, you don't really experience a cold winter. You different climate in the wintertime, but not the freezing temperatures that we typically have here. So winter means a lot of different things. And even when you are in the cold zones of the world, winter differs quite a bit. This slide, this picture, this map shows different colors for different types of winter regimes. They differ with regard to whether or not the winter is dry or wet, whether the summer is dry or cold or hot. So there's quite a bit of difference, even when we say winter and think of the typical kind of cold winter of the northern hemisphere. There's quite a bit of difference in what winter means. Um, and most likely, bryophytes are adapting differently in these different types of winter regimes. The majority, there are about 20,000 species of bryophytes described, and about 40 to 60% of them can grow in a climate where there is a cold winter. About 10,000 species grow in an area that where there is a winter. Actually, 12,000, and of that 12,000, only about 2,000 seem to be restricted to Arctic alpine habitats, and then the remaining just don't seem to be able to tolerate a cold winter at all. So it suggests that the majority of bryophytes can cope with a cold winter, although in some cases they don't absolutely require it. But a few do. A few of the specialists really won't grow any place but in an Arctic climate. So, what are some of the features that help bryophytes survive in the cold? There's the way they grow, and there's just the basic features of the bryophyte way of life, which is the ability to desiccate and rehydrate. And then they have chemical protections at the cellular level. And we'll talk about a few of these different things. First of all, habitat. I mean, bryophytes never grow as individual stems. Obviously, they always grow in a mat or a colony. And just that the very fact of that clumping means that they retain moisture a little bit longer than they would if they were individual stems, and they also stay a little bit warmer. So they have the way that bryophytes grow provides some sort of a buffering to the cold temperatures that come with winter. Um, and of course, sometimes they can well they have the ability to occupy crevices in rocks or bark or on the underside of rocks or in very protected habitats where again it may get cold, but it may get less cold and it may get cold more gradually. So the very nature of the way bryophytes grow protects them somewhat from the kinds of extremes of temperature of cold that other organisms or larger organisms are facing. But the real key to bryophyte success in winter is this feature that's called poikilohydry. I put the derivation of the word up there. It's a Greek word, and it has to do with fluctuating. And what it really means is that the hydration level of a bryophyte fluctuates in equilibrium with the surrounding environment. The opposite of poikilohydry is homoiohydry, which characterizes vascular plants that can get water from deep underground with their roots, that have a cuticle, a waxy surface, coating on the surface that keeps water from leaking out, stomates that control the opening and closing of the access to the leaf. But bryophytes don't have any of that. Well, they do have stomates, but its stomates on some capsules don't necessarily function the same way as they do in flowering plants. But what this means is for bryophytes, when the air is dry, they're dry. And in many winter climates, water is in a solid form and thus not available to the organisms. And so the way the bryophytes in the same situation in the wintertime, even in a very wet climate normally, is in the same situation as a desert moss where water, the water is not available because it's tied up. So, but it turns out in the case of the wintertime that this dehydration is a very good thing in a winter scenario because it reduces the amount of freezable water and limits ice formation in the cells. And ice is a real enemy to proper cellular functions. Um, Bryophytes, like most poikilohydric organisms, can have the characteristic of being able to quickly resume normal metabolic activity upon thawing or re-wetting. And so they can, in the wintertime, many times when it warms up a little bit, the sun is bright, they can resume normal activities. So it's probably not correct to think that bryophytes, for the most part, desiccate in whatever, November at a high elevation, and then don't start again until spring. There are probably many times when they warm up, get a little bit of cellular function, and then dry out and go back to dormancy. So turns out Poikilohydry also is the name of an album by an artist named Black Tent. Um, I listened to a little bit. I did not include a recording here. He describes his music as ambient drone and noise, which I think is a pretty good description of it. But the link is there should you want to listen to Poikilohydry. So bryophyte cells, we've all seen in cells that look like this when they're alive, they're happy, they're full of chloroplasts. But as in other plant cells, there's an awful lot going on in the cell besides just the chloroplasts. Most of the other organelles are hidden. They're much too small to see with a compound scope. But just to remind you of basic cell biology, there's a diagram of a plant cell. And when a cell is working normally, there's a huge amount of interaction among all of these parts. Chemicals are being produced in one place, moving to another place, and carrying out all the basic cell functions. Critical in the case of desiccation, in the subject of desiccation, is this vacuole. Looks kind of like a swimming pool here in the middle of the cell. That's a big water sac, which maintains the turgor of the cell, helps to keep the cell from collapsing, and also is a source of water supply. Um, but when bryophytes desiccate, one of the things that happens is the water leaves those vacuoles. The cells do collapse a bit, but they don't entirely stop functioning. But pulling the water out of the vacuole is very important. If you were to take one of your house plants, if you have most of our house plants are tropical, and you stuck it in the freezer overnight, when you got it out, it would probably be limp and lifeless because that plant did not have the capability or the opportunity to get the water out of the cells. And that ice formation in the cell disrupts the membranes of the other organelles. It just messes everything up. And a cell that's full of ice just can't function properly. There's apparently there is a hormone called abscisic acid. It's the hormone that's responsible for leaves falling in the fall. If you live in a climate where plants lose their leaves in the fall, that's the hormone that causes that, and that's the same chemical that is responsible for telling the vacuole, sensing that things are drying out, and telling the vacuole to empty itself out and get ready for a period of desiccation. Reading the literature about mosses in winter, I found numerous mentions of something called extracellular freezing, which is the idea that the cells push water out when it starts to freeze, but the water stays in between the cells, and that in and of itself acts as a bit of a temperature buffer for the cell itself. Now, this is documented in ferns, and you'll if you read about mosses in winter, you'll find reference to it. I couldn't find any particular studies that describe the phenomenon in bryophytes. So it may occur, but it may not. I'm not sure. But there's a mechanism in ferns that has been studied, so possibly it's just a lack of studies in bryophytes. But much better, excuse me, documented are some of the chemical ways that bryophyte cells protect their parts during drying. There's a series of proteins. They're called LEA proteins, which LEA stands for late embryogenesis abundant proteins. What all that really means is it was first described from seeds. Seed is, in a higher plant, is basically a housing for the little baby plant, the little embryo. And it was in cotton seeds that they first found this particular protein, and so that's why they call it LEA proteins. But what they do, and this diagram sort of shows it, on the left we have a happy cell. The proteins are just floating around, and those little circles are membrane bound, very generalized membrane bound organelles. But when the cell dries out, these proteins just kind of clump around the organelles and help it just physically make a physical barrier that keeps the whole organelle from just kind of rupturing and dying. These kinds of proteins are found, as I said, in the seeds of cotton plants. They're also known from bacteria, from nematodes, rotifers, and so some other poikilohydric organisms. They kind of act, as I write here, as molecular chaperones that keep the proteins from damage, and they kind of form a glassy matrix, which just physically holds the organelles in place. And there are sugars. Sugars do the same thing. Sugars play a similar role. Sucrose accumulates often in high concentration in desiccant-tolerant bryophytes, and it keeps the cells from collapsing. It actually forms hydrogen bonds, so reversible bonds within the cell that, again, keep it from collapsing in on itself. And they help to put the cell in a state of suspended animation and keep the membranes from breaking down and other structures from getting damaged. Trehalose is a similar sugar. Sucrose is a glucose and a fructose molecule. Trehalose is similar. It's two glucose molecules that are linked together. It does very much the same thing as sucrose, but it also helps to it triggers what they call autophagy. So when when a cell is damaged, it will help kind of get rid of that cell. Or when organelles are damaged, it helps kind of break them down so new ones can form. So it keeps the cell clean, kind of. Trehalose is something you might have come in contact with. It's a lubricant for eye drops. Many times you buy eye drops or artificial tears, they will have this trehalose in them. So winter desiccation in bryophytes may trigger the accumulation or exacerbate the accumulation of these things called reactive oxygen species. And these are unstable oxygen-containing molecules that are kind of generated as a byproduct of cellular metabolism. They're kind of mistakes. And they can cause damage to DNA and other kinds of important cell chemicals like enzymes and fats. They're sometimes referred to as free radicals. And I'm sure you've encountered in the nutrition literature that they're things that you should eat, like blueberries, antioxidants, which will help to reduce the damage caused by these reactive oxygen species. And the bryophytes are in a perfect position to be damaged by these because they're in the wintertime, they're subject to drought and high light intensity. And of course, some of these other factors too will affect bryophytes, like salinity and heavy metals and so forth. But bryophytes have a whole series of chemicals, enzymes, some of the ones listed here, and some other, a variety of other chemicals of various types that help to protect them from the damages that can be caused by these reactive oxygen species. So, as you know, photosynthesis is the process by which plants and bryophytes and all plants convert light energy into food in the form of sugar. And there are two parts to the process. There's the light reaction, which is where light energy is harvested from the sun by the chlorophyll molecule and that light energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of ATP. And then from there, that ATP goes to the other part of the um, photosynthesis, which is the Kelvin cycle, where that energy is used in combination with CO2 to create sugars, which the cell uses for a variety of processes. So when you look at bryophytes in the wintertime, they're often green, even sometimes under the ice. And I suspect that means they are photosynthesizing, but there can be problems with photosynthesizing at a cold temperature. The light reaction continues to take place. It's not really bothered by cold, but the Calvin cycle doesn't. It gets slowed down as any chemical reaction does when it's cold. So what that means is that ironically, there's so much light energy is converted into chemical energy, and if it's not used, it makes the cell hot. So actually, there can be more damage in the wintertime from photosynthesis from heat damage rather than cold because there's no place for this energy to go. It turns into heat. But bryophytes have a few ways of dealing with that. One thing, they can maybe physically move their chloroplasts to a darker part of the cell. Not so easy to do when we're talking about a plant where it has only a single cell thick leaf. But that is one thing that happens. Is photos is the actual chloroplasts migrate to a different part of the cell. Then there's also what they call non-photochemical quenching, which is the dissipation of excess absorbed light, which is as heat, and then that is just forced out of the cell. Um, so so this is, I mean, and in connection with that, sometimes that triggers the production of secondary plant pigments. We've all seen bryophytes that are in bright sun that have red or brown, purple or black pigmentation. All of that happens to slow down this light reaction so that the cells don't overheat and can keep in a relatively good connection or synchrony with the Kelvin cycle that produces the food. So, in my search for studies that compared life histories of bryophytes based on the climate in which they grow, it was largely unsuccessful. There are some studies that talk about the life history of an alpine moss, so forth, but there's not much comparative data. So it's kind of hard to say for me anyway, based on the literature, that there are any particular strategies that bryophytes in very cold climates do in terms of the reproductive cycle, as opposed to those that don't have that constraint. Um, and so when we look at a moss like this orthotrichum, we see old capsules, old empty capsules, which are probably from a previous year. And then you see some young ones with their nice hairy calyptras, which are probably much more recent. But when exactly the whole reproductive process starts, when the antheridia and archegonia are produced, when fertilization occurs, there just don't seem to be a lot of studies that you can use to kind of generalize any strategies. One thing I think we can say for sure is they must try to get this done pretty quickly because certainly conditions are better when there's free water, and a reasonable temperature for the reproductive process to take place. But here's a case where really just very kind of tedious field studies would be needed to find out how indeed they cope with that. Um, so bryophytes have managed to pull off existing in a cold climate by hook or by crook, by one technique or another. They're very well adapted to coping with extreme cold regimes, and this is a huge benefit in Arctic and alpine ecosystems where bryophytes often dominate the ground in polar regions, alpine and boreal environments where vascular plants can't really make it, or not very many of them. Tolerance of bryophytes to this repeated freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and the desiccation involved in that helps to stabilize soil, retain moisture, and makes it possible for those vascular plants that do grow there to get a foothold and to start to grow. Um, and in the wintertime, the bryophyte communities on a sunny day with a little bit of warmth can continue carbon sequestration and provide microsites for all of the microbial and vertebrate life. So it's a good thing bryophytes can do this. They maintain the integrity of these many alpine and Arctic conditions, which both animals and humans rely on. So there's a surprising number. I was kind of surprised at how many published studies there are on the physiological responses of bryophytes to cold and drought. And most of that work has been done on this little moss, Viscometrium patens. It's found worldwide in muddy areas. It's an ephemeral. They find it in the early spring. And although it's super cute, it's in no way a typical moss by virtue of its cosmopolitan distribution, its ephemeral life cycle. Um, and although it does have properties that make it an extremely important experimental organism. They call it the knockout moss because, and I cannot go into detail on this, but it is possible in this moss very easily to activate or deactivate certain genes. With pretty good precision, you can knock out a gene and induce another gene, and you can then replicate the DNA of that. And this is the basis of a variety of different products. They call it molecular farming. And because of this, we know a lot about this moss. There's a whole library of this moss and its genetic variants. And that's all great. It's also been into space. This one's, they took it into space. But it leads me to wonder how universal is what we see in Piscometrium? How applicable is this to all other mosses? Um, Work on ferns has shown that there's at least two genetically very different adaptations for dealing with desiccation. Um, Filmy ferns have a very different strategy from some of the more temperate ferns. And maybe this is true in bryophytes as well, but of course, most of our information comes from just this one moss, so we don't really know the full strategy. So any talk about uh, winter tolerance in bryophytes, you have to understand, is just based on a lot of it's based on this one little moss. So anyway, we don't know for sure. There's a lot we don't know. For example, we don't, like I just said, we don't know how if there are other strategies that haven't been identified. We don't know, the full range of adaptations because we've just looked at this one moss, which isn't particularly well adapted to cold climates. Um, we don't know, like in the map I showed at the beginning with the different types of winter, the degree to which mosses may specialize in those different, in a particular type. And something that interests me, because in a former life I did a lot of work on tropical bryophytes, is how different are they? Because tropical bryophytes, we think of them as living in a glorious wet environment, but actually they're very subject to desiccation, whether they live on the branches of trees or on the surface of living leaves. Water comes and goes, and they spend a lot of time not wet, especially in the dry season. So, are the mechanisms that they have for maintaining, are they the same as the bryophytes in winter? We don't know. So, as with everything, when you ask one question, you find it leads to some answers, but mostly a whole lot more questions. So anyway, that's it. Thanks. If there's anything I can try to explain further, I'm happy to do so.